What if the person you mocked was the only one who could save your life? And what if the real danger wasn't the boy, but someone much closer? Paris, a luxury cafe, a boy in rags, and a glass of poison. The city of Paris was alive in all its splendor, a city filled with culture, history, and beauty. The Eiffel Tower stood proudly in the distance, its silhouette striking against the clear blue sky. The streets buzzed with the sound of conversations, footsteps, and the clinking of glasses. At a well-known outdoor cafe, elegantly dressed patrons sipped espresso and nibbled on pastries, as if time had slowed down just for them. The aroma of fresh croissants and expensive coffee hung in the air, mixing with the sense of spring. It was the type of place where wealth and privilege were on full display. But sitting on the outskirts of this scene, ignored by nearly everyone around him, was a young boy named Malik, a 12-year-old black boy. He stood out not because of his presence, but because of his stark difference from the others. His clothes were ragged, his shoes worn thin from walking the city streets. Barefoot, carrying a basket of bottled water to sell, his eyes were filled with a mix of determination and weariness, yet his every move seemed to scream of being overlooked, as if he didn't belong in a world so full of comfort and wealth. Malik had seen it before, this world of privilege that turned a blind eye to those like him, but that didn't stop him from doing what he could to survive. The wealthy patrons glanced past him, as if his existence was nothing more than a blur to them. No one saw the hardship in his eyes, the weight of survival on his young shoulders. And then there was her, Madeleine Dupont. She was everything Malik was not: rich, sophisticated, and self-absorbed. Sitting at a table, her fingers tapping away at her phone, her iced drink resting beside her like an accessory. She looked the part of the Parisian elite: tailored outfits, perfect hair, a face that could grace magazine covers. The world seemed to revolve around her, and she was blissfully unaware of the dangers lurking beneath her casual, carefree exterior. Malik watched her, not because he wanted to. He was simply looking for someone who might buy one of his bottles of water. He wasn't expecting anything from her. He wasn't expecting anything from anyone. But what he didn't know was that, in that very moment, he was the only one who could save her life. Malik's focus shifted when he noticed the woman's glass, sitting beside her, a tall glass of iced tea, glistening with condensation. He watched as she lazily stirred it with a straw, oblivious to the world around her. Something about it caught his eye. He didn't know why at first, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. He stepped a little closer, just enough to see the glass clearly. There was a strange color to the ice, something unusual, something he couldn't quite place. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. After all, he was used to feeling like an outsider. But there it was again, the way the ice cubes seemed to move in the glass, the subtle difference in the color of the liquid. He had seen enough to know when something was off. His heart raced. Malik didn't hesitate. He needed to do something. He had no idea what the woman was drinking, but his gut told him it was wrong. He knew he had to act, to step in, even if it meant risking everything. As he moved toward her, the voices around the cafe blurred out, the conversations fading into the background. All that mattered now was the glass, and the woman who had no idea what was happening. What would happen next would change everything. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Drop a comment below. Have you ever been so sure of yourself, only to realize you were wrong? Water, ma'am? Just €1. It's hot today. Malik's voice cracked slightly, a hint of desperation as he held up a bottle of water, but his gaze never wavered from the woman sitting at the table. Madeleine Dupont looked up at him slowly, her expression initially uninterested, as though he were an annoyance to her. Her perfectly manicured fingers curled around her glass, raising it to her lips with a graceful air of superiority. "Water? From you?" she asked, almost condescendingly. Her voice was sharp, and she seemed to enjoy the way her words landed. She lifted the glass even higher, letting the light glint off the glass and the ice inside. "Why would I drink from a dirty street kid when I have this?" she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Nearby tables broke into laughter, a few people sneering and sharing knowing glances. The sound of their amusement echoed in Malik's ears, but he didn't let it show. He had heard this before. People like her, people who looked down on others, especially kids like him, had made him feel invisible for so long. But today, he refused to shrink back. Malik's grip on the water bottle tightened. He swallowed, trying to ignore the sting of her words. It wasn't easy, but it wasn't the first time someone had treated him like this. He could feel the heat of the sun beating down on his back, sweat trickling down his forehead. But it wasn't the heat that made his stomach churn. It was something else. Her drink. Malik's eyes flicked to the glass, the condensation dripping down its sides. It was a tall glass of iced tea, and it shimmered under the sunlight. Something was off about the way the ice cubes gleamed. They were too perfect, too clean. Malik had seen a lot of things in his short life. He had grown up on the streets, after all, but there was something about the ice that didn't sit right with him. It didn't match the rest of the scene. He had seen people's drinks before. He had even given them some of his bottled water. But these ice cubes, they didn't look natural. They looked too flawless, too much like they were placed there deliberately. His stomach twisted. Something was wrong. His instincts kicked in, telling him to pay attention. His heartbeat quickened. Malik swallowed hard and stepped closer. This wasn't just his usual fear or nervousness. No, this was something different, something deeper. He had lived long enough on the streets to know when something was off, when things didn't add up. He stepped forward again, barely registering the sounds of laughter and conversation around him. All that mattered now was the glass and the woman holding it. Something wasn't right. The weight of the moment hit him like a ton of bricks. He didn't know why, but it felt urgent. His hands trembled slightly, and his mind raced. "Ma'am, I think you shouldn't drink that," Malik said, his voice steadier than he felt. Madeleine glanced at him, unimpressed. "Oh, really?" she said, almost mocking. "And why should I listen to you? You're just a kid." He didn't back down. "Please, just don't drink it," he repeated, his voice firm this time. There was something in his gut telling him that this was no coincidence. She stared at him, her expression one of disbelief mixed with annoyance. "Really?" she said, clearly dismissing him. "You're just a street kid. What do you know about drinks?" But Malik stood his ground. He wasn't sure what was happening, but his instincts told him that if he didn't act, it could be too late. The voice inside his head screamed at him to stop her, to get her attention before it was too late. Would you have ignored the feeling or spoken up? Let us know in the comments. The ice. Someone switched it. I saw a man tampering with the tray behind the cafe. Please, don't drink it. Her expression shifted instantly. First, a flicker of confusion, then irritation. She looked at him as if he were nothing but a nuisance. A street kid. A nobody. "You're crazy," she muttered, brushing him off with a wave of her hand. "Get away from me." But Malik wasn't backing down. He couldn't back down. There was too much at stake. His instincts were louder than her dismissal. The life of this woman, someone who had mocked him, was in his hands, and he couldn't just stand by. She lifted the glass to her lips, her eyes narrowing in disbelief as she prepared to sip from it. And that's when Malik acted. Without thinking, he lunged forward, his hand knocking the glass out of her grasp. The glass shattered with a sharp crack, sending iced tea splashing across the table. The liquid splattered onto the cloth, onto the napkins, the silverware, everywhere but in Madeline's mouth. The shards of glass scattered, clinking as they hit the floor. The cafe went silent. Gasps echoed around them. People stared. Some people pulled out their phones to record the scene. Others just looked on in shock. The tension in the air was thick, like the aftermath of a bomb going off. Madeline jumped to her feet, her face flushing with anger. Her hand trembled as she pointed at Malik, her voice shaking with fury. "How dare you!" She screamed, her voice high and shrill, a mix of disbelief and outrage. "Do you have any idea who I am? I could have you arrested for this." Malik stood there, heart racing, but he didn't take a step back. His breath came in ragged gasps as he faced her. He wasn't afraid anymore. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice unwavering. "You were about to drink poison." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth of the moment. Malik watched her face as the realization started to sink in. The color drained from her cheeks, and for a moment she looked just as shocked as everyone else. Her hand still hovered in the air, as if the glass might reappear in her grasp. "You," she stammered, trying to regain control of the situation, but her words faltered. Malik took a slow step back, watching her carefully. He knew that what he had done wasn't easy. He had risked everything, his safety, his pride, for a woman who had mocked him just minutes before. But something inside him told him that this was the right thing to do. It was the right moment to stand up, not for himself, but for what was right, even if she never realized it. Madeline stared at the wreckage on the table, the shattered glass, the spilled iced tea, and her gaze softened just for a moment. But the anger was still there, burning beneath the surface. You think you've saved me?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. "I don't think," Malik replied. "I know." The weight of those words lingered as Madeline stood there, unsure of what to say. The cafe buzzed with murmurs around them, but Malik had already made his decision. He had saved her life, not because she deserved it, but because it was the right thing to do. The room remained silent as Malik stepped away, his head held high, his heart heavy with the knowledge that he had done something good, even if the world might never see him for it. Would you have risked everything to stop her? Tell us in the comments. The tension in the cafe was thick, the air charged with disbelief. Police officers had flooded the room, clearing the crowd and taking statements from witnesses. Madeline stood frozen, her face pale, her hands trembling as she stared at the table where her drink had been. Malik, on the other hand, stood off to the side, silent but observant. He watched the scene unfold, his mind racing. His eyes darted around, scanning the room. He was waiting, expecting something more. And then it happened. A figure near the back of the cafe moved, slipping quietly through the door. The man was dressed in a tailored suit, his face calm but cold, almost too calm. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, as if he didn't care that the police were swarming the place. He seemed to be trying to disappear unnoticed, But Malik saw him. "That's him!" Malik shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "That's the man who messed with the ice!" The crowd hushed, and everyone turned their gaze toward the suspect. The police officers reacted immediately, their hands gripping their weapons as they moved toward him, their eyes locked on the man in the suit. Madeline's mouth went dry. She recognized him immediately. Her business partner. The man she had worked with for years, trusted with her company, her career. He was the last person she would have ever suspected. The officers surrounded the man, blocking his path. He stood still for a moment, not even attempting to flee. Then they grabbed him, wrenching his arms behind his back and pushing him toward the front of the cafe. "What the hell is this?" Madeline whispered under her breath, still in shock. The man didn't struggle. Instead, he sneered, looking at Madeline with disdain. "You should have known," he spat. It was supposed to look like an accident, but this little brat got in the way. Madeline stumbled back, her eyes wide with horror as the truth sank in. Her partner, someone she had trusted, someone she had worked with day in and day out, had tried to kill her. And the worst part was, it wasn't just a random act. It was a calculated plan, and she had been too blind to see it. She wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. Betrayal, anger, disbelief, each emotion hit her like a wave, crashing over her in waves. She couldn't fathom how it had come to this, how the man she had trusted most had planned her murder. Malik, standing just a few feet away, had seen the whole thing unfold. He hadn't been surprised, not in the least. He had been on the streets long enough to recognize evil in its rawest form. People like that man, people who plotted and schemed. Malik had seen them before. He had seen what betrayal looked like, the way it could be wrapped in the guise of friendship and trust. He stood still, calm in the face of it all. "I told you," Malik said simply, his voice steady. Madeline's eyes snapped to him, her shock momentarily giving way to something like respect. "You!" She trailed off, her voice shaking. "You knew." Malik just nodded, his eyes not leaving her business partner. "Yeah, I saw it in his eyes the moment I walked in. People like him, they don't hide the truth. Not from someone who's been through it." The officers were now securing the man, reading him his rights. But Madeline couldn't tear her gaze away from Malik. This boy, this kid who had nothing, had saved her life. Not just by slapping the drink from her hand, but by recognizing the danger long before anyone else. For the first time, she understood the power of someone like him, someone who had been ignored, dismissed, his entire existence treated as an inconvenience. And yet, it was him who had noticed the danger, him who had the courage to act when everyone else was frozen in place. Her stomach churned with guilt. The arrogance she had shown him earlier, those words, those glances, they had almost cost her everything. But this kid, who had every reason to walk away, had chosen to fight for her life. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. Malik shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. Just don't forget what happened here." She nodded, her hand trembling as she reached for her purse. Her mind was still trying to process everything, the shock, the betrayal, the near-death experience. But in the midst of it all, one thing was clear. She would never look at him the same way again. She reached out to him, offering him a stack of bills. "For your trouble, kid," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. But Malik didn't take it. He simply shook his head, his expression resolute. "I don't want your money," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I just wanted you to listen." Madeline froze. His words echoed in her mind, louder than the crowd of onlookers around them. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the things that most people thought they could offer in exchange for a life saved. It was about respect. It was about listening, about seeing people for who they really were, not based on their clothes or their social status. It was about recognizing humanity, where others only saw inconvenience. Her gaze softened as she watched Malik, standing tall despite the hardships he had faced. His clothes were torn, his face a little too mature for his age, but he had more dignity in his small frame than many adults she had known. For the first time, Madeline really saw him, not just as the street kid she had dismissed earlier, but as a hero, a young boy who had risked everything to save her. The weight of that truth hit her all at once, and she couldn't ignore it. The guilt for how she had treated him, the unfair assumptions she had made. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter now, more sincere. "I should have seen you differently. I didn't understand, but I do now." Malik nodded, looking at her with quiet understanding. "It's okay," he replied, his eyes steady. "I'm just trying to survive, just like everyone else." And in that moment, Madeline knew she had learned something invaluable. Money didn't define someone's worth. It didn't define who they were or what they were capable of. It wasn't the measure of a person's character or courage. She had nearly lost her life over a drink, something she had taken for granted, thinking it was safe simply because it looked the part. But she had also gained something far more valuable in the process: perspective. She reached out again, but this time it wasn't to offer money. It was to offer something that had been missing in her life: understanding. She looked at Malik, truly looked at him, seeing him for the first time as the person he was, not the label she had imposed on him. "I won't forget this," she said softly, her voice steady now. "I'll make sure others don't forget it either." The words were simple, but they carried a weight behind them that Malik could feel. In that moment, Madeline had made a promise to herself, not just to see people for what they could give her, but for who they were. As Malik turned to leave, she realized that the world had just shifted in a small, profound way. A boy who had no reason to help her, who had nothing to gain, had taught her more about humanity and respect than she could ever have imagined. She watched him walk away, a little boy with the strength of a giant, a quiet hero in the making. And for the first time, Madeline understood that real change didn't come from wealth or power. It came from the simple act of listening. Malik's lesson wasn't just about saving her life. It was about saving her soul, opening her eyes to the world beyond her bubble, and reminding her that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn every day from the people around you. Where are you watching from? And what time is it? Drop a comment below.